Okay, so it's been a fantastic day of research so far, and it's my pleasure to chair this final session on media and culture. And we're going to start with a pre-recorded presentation from Heriot-Watt KALINTAS about the politics of gender and sexuality in Alevi theatre.
The title of my presentation is The Politics of Gender and Sexuality in Alevi Theatre. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity to share my research with you today. My presentation is based on my dissertation, which I am writing as part of a much larger project named Staging National Objection, Theatre and Politics in Turkey and its Diasporas, funded by European Research Council. Today, I will be talking about how theatre provides critical opportunities to reveal and revise historical accounts to develop feminist and queer formulations of Alevi identity. As I will state it again later on, my main argument is that theatre serves as a site for the members of Alevi communities to challenge the myth of Alevi gender equality and to negotiate the norms of gender and sexuality. First, let me briefly introduce you with the community and their history. The Alevi community make up the largest religious minority in Turkey. The history of the community has been one of oppression and persecution, especially since the 16th century, after Ottoman rulers claimed caliphal authority. Alevis were labeled as heretics, with their existence neither recognized nor institutionalized since. The inception of the Republic of Turkey as a secular nation state in 1923 was initially promising for the community, but the regime remained implicitly Sunni Muslim. Thus, the Alevi community's experiences of citizenship and belonging continue to be characterized by precarity. Like almost every minority that has been persecuted by the dominant power structures, Alevis have also resisted persecution and struggled to preserve their identity all through this history. The association of Alevi religious minority with gender equality has also reinforced the negative stereotypes about Sunni Muslim women as ultimately repressed, which means the gender equality in Alevi communities is generally defined in comparison to Sunni Muslims. The discourse of Alevi gender equality often ground their claims in rituals. The equal participation and co-presence of men and women in religious rituals are interpreted as an indicator of equality, not only in Alevi cosmology, but also in everyday life. However, a growing body of feminist and queer scholarship have challenged the romantic assumptions of gender equality and demonstrated how the everyday experiences of Alevi women and LGBTIQ+ individuals are also defined by cis heteropatriarchy. Even more importantly, under the neoliberal Sunni Islamist authoritarian populist regime of the Justice and Development Party, Alevi women and LGBTIQ+ individuals are intersectionally vulnerable to discrimination and violence. The performance perspective of the contemporary debates on the politics of gender and sexuality in Alevi communities is an important yet largely ignored side. However, these critical debates take place in and through theatre, so theatre provides critical opportunities to review and revise historical accounts and develop feminist and queer formulations of collective memory. Today, first, I will introduce how the community began to employ theatre in their struggle with the politics of objection. Then I try to show when gender and sexuality begin to emerge as a topic in this history. The plays staged by Alevi community theatres and professional groups in Turkey and its diasporas have focused primarily on the histories of violence and persecution against Alevis. As such, theatre functions as a site for the constitution of public memory through intergenerational transfer of trauma and serves the effective politics of community building among the transnational Alevi communities. The Alevi dramatic texts and productions have engaged with the politics of gender and sexuality in explicit or implicit way. Most of the plays written by Alevi playwrights explore the discrimination against women and exploitative marriage practices and show the discourse on gender equality in Alevism is nothing but a myth. Alevis were exposed to marginalizations through the rumors shaped around sexuality during the Ottoman and Republican periods, especially essentially due to their rituals where men and women co-present. Ayfer Karacaistan argues that this is mainly due to the difference between the methods of controlling sexuality. According to her, in Sharia Islam, although sexuality is seen as a natural need, mainly female sexuality is regarded as destructive to the social order, and precisely for this reason, sexuality should be controlled in the social realm. The solution of Sharia Islam to this danger was separating the physical spaces of men and women. On the other hand, Alevis accepted both men and women as bodies that have been stripped of their sexuality, that is asexual, in the rituals. However, since there is no such idea of a body stripped of its sexuality in Sharia Islam, Alevis have been the object of accusations of incest and polygamy, or they were blamed of being dirty or filthy, for example, because of this co-presence of men and women. This objectification continued in the Republican era as well, because, as Karen Shimakawa argues, that national objection is a process in which the minorities occupy the seemingly contradictory, yet functionally essential position of the constituent element and radical other. Object groups play an essential and mutually constitutive role in the national subject formation, since nation building processes comprise not only of creating imagined communities. Construction and maintenance of borders around the national subject function by excluding object groups as they demarcate the borders of a national subject. Thus, throughout the history of the Republic, the Alevi community's experiences of citizenship and belonging continued to be characterized by precarity as they occupied a category of national objection. Playwrights in Turkey's vibrant alternative theater scenes discuss the experiences of Alevi women to explore queer and trans politics as well. Ali Cüneyt Kılıçoğlu's Muhallim'in Şahane Baskısı, The Fantastic Pressure of My Neighborhood, narrates the story of three women living in a conservative Istanbul neighborhood. Seher, a folk singer who is a member of the Alevi religious minority, Wuse, a trans worker, and Nihal, a conservative Sunni Muslim and Kurdish housewife. Each woman in the play represent an objective category, and as such, all of them often experience physical violence and social oppression both in their homes and in their neighborhood. The play investigates the promises and limits of trans-inclusive intersectional feminism and how these women struggle with the practices of abjection all through their everyday lives in the peripheries of metropolitan Turkey. Some private companies obtaining government funding to produce plays about Alevi history and rituals and gaining access to the Alevi venues at the expense of Alevi companies. My preliminary fieldwork at the Hacı Bektaş Veli commemoration ceremonies and culture and art activities in Nevşehir has demonstrated how these productions create controversy among the Alevi audiences, especially because of the gender politics of representation. For example, in a play named Hünkar, in which the life of Hacı Bektaş Veli was narrated, there were semi-ritual scenes in a modernized fashion, performed by men only, although it is one of the rituals of Alevi belief co-performed by men and women. For example, in the play, the interviews I conducted with the audiences after the show revealed how the discourse of gender equality in the rituals is still crucial as part of Alevi identity, since all the interviewees underlined that half of the performance should have been women in the scene. When the interviewees learned that the sponsor of the play is the Director of Communication of the Turkish Republic, one of them said that that scene makes sense then, since that is how the state wants Alevism to be, and she added that in Alevi culture there is gender equality and they do not want this, I mean like the state. But actually when you ask them is there a gender equality or not, they acknowledge that it is not a real equality, but they need this urge to defend their Alevi identity in such a case. Resistance is an attitude for the oppressed and persecuted communities. To resist the assimilation policies of power structures, they must constantly reconstruct their identities and collective memories. When the members of such a community consider something from outside as a threat, the reflexive reaction is generally to defend the common attitude of the community no matter what. For this very reason, the audience who receives the information that the play is the government-approved one within a defensive mode can reproduce and reinforce the existing myth, regardless she or he believes it is it or not. Due to the loyalty to the group identity, the attitude of women is in harmony with the identity of the community, and it becomes a duty to reflect it accurately. Marriage, divorce, custody of children, and above all, inheritance and property rules, which are essential criteria in terms of understanding the status of women in other societies, also exist in Alevi societies, and they are tried to be justified based on cultural customs and traditions as usual. Unfortunately, the rhetoric that women and men are equal in Alevis often only addresses the existing gender inequality. However, due to the fragile position of being an unrecognized minority, more urgent and major problems cover up the minor ones. So there's a more difficult challenge for Alevi women because of their intersectional identities. Performance can become an efficient means of analyzing the inner dynamics of a community, especially the ones that have more urgent and major problems covering up the minor ones. Due to the long-term struggle of the Alevi community to gain official recognition, the problems within the community regarding gender and sexuality were put into the background and postponed with the thought that it would play into the hands of the power. However, the feminist movement has encouraged Alevi women to talk about their problems, open the myths and rumors to the discussion. And I can say that with the correct analysis of theatrical text, dramatic literature, and audience reactions, it is possible to trace these discussions. Thank you.
Many thanks to Ruya for that really interesting paper and observations about how performance kind of reflects and resists. I'd next like to invite Joe ONDRAK to come and talk about Creepypasta to the Capital. Fourth generation digital fiction, non-consensual Playspaces, and narrative radicalisation.
Yes. Okay, so you might be wondering why there's a picture of my dog at the start of this. This is mostly just to say that on Saturday morning, he ran up to give me a cuddle, nutted my tooth out, so I spent a Sunday at an emergency dentist, so if I trip over my words, I'm learning to use a new tooth, and it's all his fault. So, on to my paper. So in this paper, you can't see the MAGA hat photoshopped onto Slenderman. That encapsulates all of it. Okay, so in this paper, I intend to draw a distinct line between my PhD research into creepypasta and my day job investigating disinformation. Here, taken to refer to various deliberately seeded rumours, myths intended to deceive or cause harm, and conspiracy narratives, so a very broad definition there. Specifically, in terms of how both leverage certain affordances and traits of being online, and how an analysis of the former can lead to a better understanding of the latter. To begin, I will define creepypasta in relation to fourth generation digital fiction, before discussing how it uses that form to create ontologically ambiguous spaces for narrative and play that force us to confront and interrogate the nature of being online. Then, using the Waukesha Slenderman stabbing as a pivot to highlight the dangers of these ontologically ambiguous spaces, I will then turn my attention to how disinformation, again as a catch-all term, deliberately leverages what was an accidental catalyst for a tragedy in Wisconsin. So at the risk of patronising the audience here, I'd like to kick off by defining creepypasta. I assume that many of you are familiar with the term, but please bear with me. In my PhD research, I argue that creepypasta is an emergent genre with horror and gothic traits that manifests through the form of digital fiction and derives its horror affect through this form. So what do I mean by that? Well, creepypasta is defined by the internet communities that first created it and understood by those communities as a certain type of fiction. It is, at its most basic, a mutation of the neologism copypasta. That is, as scholar Line Harrison states, a short text, sometimes accompanied by an image or video that is intended to be copied, pasted, and circulated online, but more specific, often intended to unnerve the reader and/or viewer, and typically engaging with the horror genre or paranormal, hence the shift from copy to creepy. We can work back from Stephen Neal's view of genre as repetition with difference to understand how widely variable and different narratives can fall under creepypasta as a generic umbrella here. As a genre, it is also form specific to to digital fiction, as fiction in a digital setting is undeniably what creepypasta is at a formal level. Digital fiction is defined by the Digital Fiction International Network, I'm going to say fiction so many times here, as fiction that is written for and read on a computer screen and that pursues its verbal, discursive and/or conceptual complexity through the digital medium, and crucially would lose something of its aesthetic and semiotic function if it were removed from that medium. Specifically, creepypasta manifests through what is regarded as fourth generation digital fiction. This fourth generation of digital fiction is distinguished in that the social media platform plays a significant part of the aesthetic expression and the meaning potential. Of importance here are the distinctions that it takes the shape and structure of a platform already defined and defined for different purposes, and the acknowledgement that the venue of social media is of importance in the appearances and the aesthetic and the semiotic aspects of the social digital work. The co-opting of existing social media platforms also allows for numerous mode possibilities that come with the various forms of social media platforms, such as long-form text posts, video, user interaction, as well as taking advantage of different ways in which users operate, read, and interact with content on each platform. As such, creepypasta narratives subtly and flexibly change their discursive traits between platforms, integrating seamlessly into people's streams alongside posts by real people. I argue that by doing this, creepypasta is emblematic of a post-postmodern cultural term, specifically focusing on Brian McHale's reading of Geoffrey Leland's post-postmodernism, Alan Kirby's digimodernism, and Vermeulen and Vandernack's metamodernism. All three appear to describe sometimes overlapping symptoms of this emerging period that relate to creepypasta's meaning potential, as well as its formal and aesthetic properties. These relations are mostly informed by approaches towards the network social media spaces on which these texts are written and spread. McHale and Kirby both cast an eye explicitly towards digital media, with McHale remarking that digital media has made virtual realities more pervasive than ever, leading to the erosion of ontological stability, whilst Kirby's digimodernism is inherently characterized as where digital technology meets textuality, allowing the reader to intervene textually, to physically make text, to add visible content, or tangibly shape narrative development, which is clearly a view that can be applied to social media. Metamodernism, on the other hand, takes shape as a structure of feeling prevailing in contemporary culture. This is characterized by an oscillation between the modern and the postmodern in order to move towards something new. One way in which this oscillation manifests is in informed naivety, a shift away from the guarded irony and cynicism of postmodernism towards something more pervasive and sincere, whilst maintaining that true sincerity cannot occur due to our contemporary culture still left in the wake of postmodernism. The three theories coalesce in the mechanics of our reception to social media and what Kirby refers to as the rise of the apparently real. For Kirby and digimodernism, the apparently real is the outcome of silent negotiation between the viewer and the screen. We know it's not totally genuine, but we will take it. If it seems to be, then we will take it as such. In this sense, a metamodern informed naivety is necessary in order to meaningfully engage with others in social media settings, with Kirby remarking that Wikipedia, message boards, and social networking sites clearly require, in order to function at all, a level of sincerity in their users. It's this core idea of sincerity and reception that underpins the operation of social media and digital communication more generally, that both creepypasta and disinformation hijack. There are, of course, individuals posting both creepypasta and disinformation, those on the other side, those aware of the falsehood or fictionality, hoping to deceive for any number of reasons. For creepypasta, this may be considered a form of play, interacting with the narrative and characters therein as if they were real, posting such experiences on platforms alongside the real experiences of other users. The Slender Man is a multifaceted, mimetic patchwork of narratives and content. These are all created independently, but with knowledge of one another, sharing the faceless character at the centre of it. Each entry into the Slender Man pantheon expands or embellishes slightly on what has come before, each potentially being spread autonomy and forming a single creepypasta narrative. The Slender Man can be traced back to a single thread on something awful, with users attempting to create paranormal images with the goal of having them spread from the thread and being mistaken as real paranormal images on the wider internet. An initial picture of Slender Man created by Eric Knudsen was posted early in the thread, quickly becoming the star monster. Others began contributing their own iterations to the monster before a notable shift occurred for those discussing their contributions from open fictions to presenting them as fruits of research into the Slender Man in the real world, playing with boundaries of fact and fiction, virtual and real, experience and narrative. For Aaron Trammell and Anne Gilbert, however, the Slender Man and the tragic attempted murder of Peyton Lautner by Anissa Weir and Morgan Gazer in 2014 serves as a warning for playing with ontological boundaries. They argue that a new vocabulary and approach to play is required in order to counter traditional understandings of play, which is reduced to something we do and neglect the way in which it can take a life of its own, and forget how it's always acting upon us. The game of Slenderman, what Trammell and Gilbert refer to as its scheme, is the insistence that the figure should circulate promiscuously. In other words, it has a life of its own. Interactivity, play, and spread are, according to the two, intrinsically linked. The Slenderman's life of its own is the result of players taking part in a participatory and collective ritual. In the context of the Slenderman, all involved have been indicted in the evocation and animation of the monster. It is through participation, they argue, that the Slenderman narrative perpetuates, persists, and apparently appears to have an autonomy outside the control of any one creator or creative community. The reason for this persistence of the Slenderman is because the Slenderman, from the start, operated as a near open source horror meme that has evolved by the collective imaginations of innumerable participants across internet sites. This participation, in turn, grants an apparent life to the eponymous monster, apparently produced out of the collective will of many. However, Trammell and Gilbert warn that play is also a disposition towards media outside the game, and it carries dangers. They argue that it is a process that makes the fiction take on an effective actuality that blurs the supposed distinctions between illusion and reality. As those playing the game of the Slenderman are doing so by the scheme or rules set out by Nudson's original post, they must treat their entry into the participatory or collective ritual as if it were real and the text as a documentation of their experience. In this way, Trammell and Gilbert argue that play produces effective worlds which themselves mould us, with the site of play for the Slenderman being social media and not a commonly accepted game space. Because of this, the Slenderman can be stumbled across and engaged by those not knowing the rules of the formative scheme with which to navigate the effective world produced by the collective will and content of those playing. In the wake of the Walkish tragedy, it is the collective play action, they argue, that produced depositories filled with beings that possess powers and ramifications. Ultimately, as the space of play is not bound or marked by any paratextual indicators, the use of social media platforms may become unwitting. Though users of social media platforms may become unwitting participants in a game they do not know the rules for. Much like the Slenderman, disinformation and conspiracy narratives also aim to blur the distinction between facts and fiction on platforms that are fundamentally based on a level of sincerity and trust between users. Much like fans of Creepypasta, believers in QAnon, the Great Reset, or sovereign citizen conspiracies also participate in perpetuating the reality of those narratives by spreading, remixing, and retelling various elements in a collective and participatory ritual. Whether it is a mythical video of Hillary Clinton conducting child sacrifice, depopulation plots through bioengineered viruses or vaccines, or the idea that the US and the UK are in fact corporations and not countries, the fictional nature of these beliefs and the sincerity with which they are believed matters little to those posting when they treat it as if it's fact. To those who stumble across these areas where these beliefs are being played, especially those who may have a disposition towards these beliefs, the conviction in rhetoric, interactivity with the community, and the sheer amount of content being repeated in the same or similar messages may be enough to tip them into sincere belief. Where creepypasta and disinformation differ, however, is in the resonance with existing beliefs and the desire for the world depicted to be true. While an encounter with a creepypasta narrative may result in a friction of briefly considering the world with the potential for monsters such as the Slenderman, their threat to us quickly dissipates when one attempts to square that with the world of our own physical experiences. Conspiracy-based disinformation, on the other hand, relies on potential political resonance to reinforce beliefs that readers may already hold. If you don't like Hillary Clinton, why not have her be a child-sacrificing Satanist? If things feel off in spheres beyond your control and that they're dictating political decisions, maybe that's exactly what it is. The desire to reinforce one's existing beliefs through narrative is what drives disinformation with a force that creepypasta can never truly attain. After all, nobody wants a world with paranormal monsters in the same way they want their political adversaries to be monstrous. I've got another slide, but I'm going to leave it there because I read 15 minutes on the brief rather than 10.
Thank you, Joe. So I would like next to invite Joe Turner up. with a great title, The Gods Are Like Publishers, usually male. The poetic potential for anti-stereotypical myth. Let me just check it. Does anyone else find when they're doing this or doing teaching or something that was very like simple task, something becomes much more difficult? Apologies, I'll hand over.
Hello, everyone. My name is Chloe. I study in the English and Related Literature department here at York. I've spent the last 4 years combining my interests as a poet with my research into feminist revisionist mythology, which is what I'm going to talk to you about today. Before I get started, I'd just like to note that my discussion will include some topics that may be uncomfortable, including sexual violence and issues of consent. So if anyone would like to step out or mute me, please feel free to do so. Okay. In 1999, Caroline Duffy published this anthology, The World's Wife, a series of dramatic monologues in which she asks us to look behind every famous man and refocus our gaze on the real movers and shakers across history, myth, and legend, women. From biblical narrative to fairy tales, folklore to popular culture, Duffy ventriloquizes women whose names and tales are familiar to us, but whose individual perspectives may not be. Several are invented or embellished. For example, Mrs. Darwin, whose quatrain monologue reads, 7th April 1852, went to the zoo. I said to him, something about that chimpanzee over there reminds me of you. In The World's Wife, and indeed throughout her career, Duffy participates in the age-old practice of feminist revisionist mythology. This methodology, defined by the seminal poet-scholar Alicia Osterreicher, as making poems for and from the lives of lost women, writers and artists who are our spiritual sisters and ancestresses, holds an enormous amount of promise for confronting the stereotypes facing modern women through a gynocentric reimagining of our oral and surviving written histories. In this presentation, I'll be adapting one chapter of my undergraduate dissertation, focusing specifically on Duffy's use of ancient Greek figures in her application for a canon of anti-stereotypical feminist myth. After all, in the words of the feminist poet Adrienne Rich, until we can understand the assumptions in which we are drenched, we cannot know ourselves. Stereotype, reliant upon generality, oversimplification, and the power imbalance between the subject and those that uphold the belief, could for those characteristics alone be considered the enemy of feminist revisionist mythology. Certainly, Duffy's own career has been publicly hindered by it. A decade after The World's Wife was published, she became the first female and first openly queer poet laureate of the United Kingdom in 2009, after a long-running campaign to get a woman into the position. She was previously passed over for the role in 1999 in favour of Andrew Motion, because the then Prime Minister Tony Blair felt her sexuality would prove unacceptable to Middle England, leaving her deeply bruised, and a casualty of the same simplified typecasting that she rejected through The World's Wife in the same year. Stereotype itself is a necessarily two-dimensional foundation of the status quo. It defies progress and critique, embedding itself deep in the collective psyche, and these characteristics enable its deliberate cultivation in the cultural familiarity and recurrent themes of myth. Stereotype is also self-sustaining. Stereotype threat, the situation in which there is a negative stereotype about a person's group, and he or she is concerned about being judged or treated negatively on the basis of this stereotype, perpetuates oppression as a deeply biased and prejudicial substantiation. In order to pin it down and pick it apart, we must attempt to understand attitudes that are changeable, defining, and often cultural, so myth serves as a suitable arena. Duffy's revised ancient Greek women exist in a controlled poetic space which she can switch, reject, and destabilize, negating the interactive possibility for the reader's reactions or prejudices, unconscious or otherwise, to modify the scene. The reclamation of power is a recurring theme throughout The World's Wife, in light of the fact that, as Osterreicher remarks, disobedient, clever, or intellectual women have often been damned as deformed by men's pens. Monstrous mythical women typically fall into one of at least 3 categories: physical nonconformity, including ugliness and deformity, like Medusa; self-sustainable power, which is like Circe, women occupying leadership roles, whether by right or by force; and violence, like Clytemnestra, murderous wife of Agamemnon. In Duffy's poem, Medusa interacts with all 3 prongs of the trident, if you'll pardon the metaphor. Medusa, plausibly the most recognizable mythological woman of ancient Greek origin to a modern audience, is Duffy's epitome of hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. She is the first example that Robert Garland gives in his remarks about the women whose acts of violence provide an outlet for their frustrations and disappointments, and a group of witch-like creatures who direct their destructiveness to all and sundry. And in Duffy's revision of her story, Medusa's destructiveness is entirely attributed to her male partner, rather than Athena's retaliatory curse after a broken vow of celibacy, either as a result of an affair or a sexual assault, according to various retellings. Being responsible for her monstrosity, it's a suspicion, a doubt, a jealousy, which causes Medusa to turn on her perfect man, Greek god. And he too is a stereotype, albeit an enigmatic example primarily found in holiday romance novels. In Ovid's Metamorphoses, as Perseus uses the unkept horror of Medusa's head to transform the Titan Atlas into a mountain, her monstrosity undergoes its own metamorphosis, becoming a weapon that can be wielded by the hero, and thus even her violent will to live is a reason to behead her. I've included this statue by Luciano Gabatti, both for its illustrative relevance and the questions that it raises. This gender-flipped reimagining of the myth depicts Medusa having beheaded Perseus in self-defense, challenging assumptions around the heavily gendered glorification of violence. The captioned image of the statue on the next slide went viral in 2018 in response to the rapidly spreading collective outrage of the Me Too movement. It's pretty cool, isn't it? The importance of protecting monstrous women in feminism, exemplified by Helen Zazou's adamance that men riveted women and their writing between two horrifying myths, between the Medusa and the abyss, and that regardless of choice or circumstance, women have been turned away from their bodies, is clearly evidenced within Duffy's deeply sympathetic retelling. Medusa insists upon accountability, directing the thoughts that hissed and spat on her scalp into two tragic rhetorical questions that neither her lover nor the reader can answer. Wasn't I beautiful? Wasn't I fragrant and young? Her monstrousness, itself a direct consequence of the transgressions of her Greek god, is encompassed into a final imperative end-stop line, a reclamation of agency and power, and ultimately a fatal redirection of the male gaze. Look at me now. This is a woman who has aged, fought, and demanded, three things that societal stereotype has historically rendered unconceivable. The question of consent is further expanded within The World's Wife, so delicately handled by Duffy that Pygmalion's Bride is over 2 decades old, yet painfully relevant to the ongoing Me Too movement, originally initiated in 2006 by Tarana Burke to create solidarity among survivors of sexual violence and contemporary feminist activism. The greatest success of the Me Too movement has been this act of forcing us to confront and name as not okay experiences that we previously shrugged off as an inevitable part of being a woman. The same experiences, the same inevitability that clings to stereotypes rightly illuminated by the unwilling lover who played statue, Stumm, like truce and me to keep him keen, purity culture, and diamonds are a gal's best friend. The girly things that Pygmalion's Bride is offered, pearls and necklaces and rings gifted under the obligation of sexual favours, exemplify the material culture that has historically surrounded women's genitalia and men's access to it. Pornography tells us that the area must be perfectly groomed, stereotype declares that access can be bought for presents, and Pygmalion, himself serving as a stereotype of the one-night stand, an arena in which men are legends and women are whores, negates interest after his bride recovers her agency and screamed her head off at the climax, thus negating the thrill of the chase. As starkly exemplified by the definition I've placed here from rape crisis in England and Wales, as soon as his statuesque lover gives enthusiastic consent, Pygmalion loses interest and disappears. The potential for sexual violence is blatant. This poem, perhaps Duffy's most blatant confrontation of stereotype, is nestled towards the end of The World's Wife. Eurydice tries desperately to avoid her mansplaining ex Odysseus as he seeks to draw her out of the underworld. Her introduction within the Odyssey, in which Emily Wilson's translation describes her as Nestor's own loyal queen, and Robert Fagles' translation strips Eurydice of authority to label her merely as his own loyal wife, emphasizes the importance of her declaration that I'd rather speak for myself. Ultimately, this is what Duffy is advocating for, the irradiation of stereotype and external misogynistic influences, leaving her women free to share their views uninhibited by societal pressure. This is gloriously meta, redefining the act of writing poetry within the poem itself, as women take an active role, serving as both muse and artist, building on the shaking off of passivity displayed by Pygmalion's Bride. The issue of sexism in the machinery which manufactures and spreads information is elaborated on by Eurydice, who notes in a droll tone that the gods are like publishers, usually male. Big O, whose great poetic reputation is mainly spread by himself and his ego, is ultimately foiled when she, who has done all the typing for Orpheus, and thus facilitated his success, compliments his poetry, causing him to turn and look back at her. To deal with ancient myth is to assume intellectual authority, but authority requires hierarchy, and said hierarchy creates opportunities for narrative influence through stereotyping lower tiers. in publishing, in higher education, and in the case of both Orpheus and Duffy, poetry. Stereotype influences gender balances within the academy as much as it does the textual interpretations. The first full English translation of Homer's Odyssey by a woman, which was completed in 2018 by Emily Wilson, who studied classics and philosophy at Oxford, notes that there was an awareness of it being a sort of boys' club in which none of her professors were women. If knowledge is gatekept by the stereotypical boys' club, it's a significant disadvantage to the feminist revisionist poet. Since the Odyssey presumes knowledge of the Iliad, Duffy could either explain the context of each poem, or, as she generally does, utilize accessible language and comfortably modern context in order for her readership to access her revised poems with or without classical education. She is, as she has often described herself, a poet for our times.
Thank you, Chloe. And to round us off, we've got Esther Wilson. Netflix is The Crown and People's Princess. How do I put this in? Just a moment. Oh, I'm not sure. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Okay, so thank you guys and fellow panelists for such a fascinating final panel so far. My name is Esther Wilson and I'm a first year PhD candidate here at York. I want to start by thanking the conference team for inviting me to speak today. It's been a huge privilege to be here and participate. As part of York's Institute for Public Understanding of the Past, or IPUP, my research predominantly looks at history within the digital sphere, with a particular focus upon social media spaces. And I'm excited to be briefly sharing some thoughts relating to this area today. So I want to start by asking you where you were when Princess Diana was announced as bride, when she was married, hounded by the press during her life, and where you were when she died. I don't want to make anyone feel old. I ask because I wasn't there. The People's Princess met her tragic end some 5 months before I was born. Yet, I'd regularly been introduced to her through various avenues. My mother's twee television documentaries, hearing Diana's name mentioned by the media press in relation to Megxit, or learning about commemorative practices during my MA here at York. Even though I wasn't there to watch Diana's story unfold or be part of the Diana phenomenon of mass emotion following her death, so-called by Paranare, such experiences have undoubtedly produced in me personal opinions on Diana and the present British political establishment. Most recently, the 4th season of Netflix hit series The Crown introduced Emma Corrin as the character of Princess Diana. The season followed the early years of her relationship and marriage to Prince Charles. The media response, in terms of both press and popular social media activity, was phenomenal. My Twitter feed was bombarded with hashtags. My Snapchat news applications were full of the real and fictional faces of Diana. My Instagram feed was scattered with memes. For a short time, it felt as if public commemoration of her was happening all over again, more than 20 years after her death. Only this time, it wasn't happening in gardens or high street stores or memorials down in London as explored by Sully in her 2010 article. It was happening digitally, triggered by the Crown's retelling and resharing of her story. It was apparent that the Crown had raised new questions, a fresh and ephemeral commemorative interest in Diana for a generation who wasn't around to know her through the filter of the press. Yet this new wave of Diana-rama had been difficult for me to understand as a public historian in training. Firstly, with its vast digital presence and public engagement with history content, the Crown has gone beyond a mere on-demand entertainment show with a variety of media from meme and video to tweet and rant. I skipped a line. The Crown has gone beyond a mere entertainment show, superseding much existing literature that may have seemed relevant. Secondly, with the variety of media from meme and video to tweet and rant, it's been difficult to pin down just how to grapple with this vast new archive of Diana, her life and legacy. How to divide between historical or on-screen truth and fiction, to unpack and understand the lines of meaning which traverse different digital spaces, and to understand the significance of diverse public sentiments relating to her. There are 3 things that I wish to highlight for this paper. Firstly, the digital sphere as an environment with new spaces for encountering history, with both hidden treasures and complications for historians when it comes to unpicking not only the past, but its presence within contemporary society, how we access, understand, remember, and commemorate it. Secondly, I want to begin to reflect upon some of the different ways that history has been done and made today. Thirdly, I want to begin to show the need for new historiographical frameworks and methodologies to better understand digital communication and how it facilitates uses of the past in relation to real-world problems. In this case, perhaps even the health of the British political establishment. So let's start with the Crown itself. Season 4 was the biggest so far, with possibly even more viewers than Charles and Diana's actual televised wedding. It was watched by 28 million people within the first week, receiving a 95% approval rating on Rotten Tomatoes. My main thesis explored how Netflix used Charles and Diana as an opportunity to deepen the relationship between viewer, product, and historical narrative. The series takes viewers on a journey of knowing and uncovering Diana and her relationship with Charles, from a naive, endearing first meeting through to spiraling personal crises. And note, there are quite a lot of those things mentioned within the series. Trigger content warning there. So they may or may not be mentioned within this presentation. The season was heavily promoted across social media. You can see some of the ways in which the Crown account did so across the Facebook platform. And its Charles and Diana narrative was often at the centre. It was a major plot device within the trailer, and we actually saw Diana's character poster on the previous slide. Citing things like the true story behind the Crown, these examples begin to demonstrate some of the issues surrounding authorship and integration of truth and the utilisation of Diana in the Crown and its digital marketing material. Through the use of authoritative branding, visual reenacted evidence, and renowned actors as interviewed voices and storytelling figureheads, such posts act to authorise and reauthorize particular retellings of the past, legitimise a multiplicity of interpretations of viewers and consumers, recontextualising and blurring real and fictional moments in Diana's life. But what did the public do with all this content? Let's get thinking about a couple of examples of publicly created social media content. What follows rather rudimentary in nature with a selection of examples pulled from my own archive of evidence, which will be used to discuss a number of observations. They're all publicly available, so I've opted to assume a reasonable level of consent, but this is an issue that isn't fully resolved yet, as far as I'm aware, in social media literature. So these posts I've given heading Royalism and Romanticisation. I find them really interesting because they both completely ignore some of the more difficult topics about Diana's life at the Crown, included as part of the series. They focus heavily on the Crown as a particular, almost fairy tale dramatisation of her life. From what I've been able to see, this seems to be typical for more positive reading content regarding the Crown's exploration of Diana. There seems to be a link between pro-monarchical sentiment, fictionalisation, and a positive response to the series and its inclusion of her, which fails to critically engage with some of the more complex commemorative public memory of the princess. Starting with the pictures on the left, we have this Instagram user named Crowned Monarchs, which suggests a pro-monarchical sentiment and standpoint. Looking at the two pictures and the text accompanying them, we can see the user understands the difference between the real Charles and Diana and the Crown. Nevertheless, there is a juxtaposition between the real life history to a drama with costume, cast, and script, dominated by events that mark the Elizabethan era, supported by the linguistic attribution of success. The utilisation of an unexpected historical term, usually used to describe the 16th, 17th centuries, makes me wonder about the contextual perspective of the user, how they understand history as part of the present, and how these are reconciled within their consumption of the Crown and related digital material. Another Instagram post on the other side of the screen is by a username Royal Grace View, which exudes the period fictional romanticisation along the lines of Bridgerton, another Netflix period drama. Utilising visuals from the show, the content of the post supports the standpoint affirmed by the username, praising the actor enthusiastically professing love for the series and Emma Corrin. The text is accompanied by a crown emoji and tags Emma in an attempt to make a digital connection with the actor. This user does demonstrate some awareness of the historical record, but also claims that Corrin portrayed young Diana very well. It even couldn't be better as for me. In spite of recognising that the show isn't a recreation of the real Diana's life, this perhaps young user who would likely not remember the later 20th century does seem to have bought into this fictionalized portrayal of who Diana was. Second and final two examples I want to look at, I have named anti-establishment and conspiracy. Conversely, we have these two negatively toned posts. On the left, you can see a still from a TikTok, which took original footage from Charles and Diana's Australia tour and gave it the caption you can see. There's no comparison with the Crown footage. Old footage is being repurposed, reposted, remobilised in new ways. Video is made by a public user, but judging by the username, not a type of fan account akin to the previous two posts. Intriguingly, the post of the user appeared to be using the Crown as an arbiter of historical authorship, using the fictional plot as a way of adding unrecorded factual details to a real historical event. Looking at the way the caption's been written, I imagine that this is a younger user, and TikTok platform tends to be a younger dominated space. They wouldn't have had access to original media footage at the time, but that's almost rendered void, considering that this original media content, the original media couldn't have seen behind the closed doors that this user's attempted to open by mobilising the Crown's narrative. The last example you can see on the right here is a Reddit extract shared on the Instagram platform. It was posted by an account which seemed to share content relating to fictional or dramatic universes, utilising the word fandom to indicate particular shared intensity or followership. With a seemingly unrelated caption, which you can see on the very far right, the Reddit content engages directly with the difficult themes explored by the Crown in relation to the treatment of Diana. The user sees Netflix's decision to push documentary programming about her along with season 4 as a counter-response to the royal family's emphasis upon season 4 as fictional, emphasising dramatised, unwitnessed private scenes relating to bullying, loneliness, and eating disorders as legitimate. The post places Netflix in a powerful, authoritative position in direct opposition to the real British royal family. It may be that Netflix pushed the content simply to ask and encourage consumers to watch more on the platform and spend more time on it. However, as an extract of an expletive conversation with apparently strong emotion, the post isn't so far away from engaging with the body of popular conspiracy theories which have circulated over recent decades relating to Diana's mistreatment, theories which even extend to the royal family arranging her death. Interesting in the context of quantum account. So, haven't got much time left because we've run out of time. A few closing remarks. Obviously, there's so many more questions here than there are answers. And I actually have no clear methodology of how to approach today because history doesn't really have one. So that's something I'm looking at in my own PhD. And I think what this emphasises to us is that powerful digital organisations such as Netflix are actively engaging with historical and commemorative consciousnesses of consumers and social media users across the digital sphere, promoting their own content involvement down across social media and being implicated, for better or for worse, in continuing narratives surrounding her life and death. The power of digital is here to stay, crossing platforms, modes and mediums, transcending the real and the fictional. The digital cannot change the past, but it may be able to alter the ways in which we think about it and how we understand both our present and future. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Esther. So we finished sort of just within the time slots. So great work, panel. We time for Q&A.
Yeah, we need to answer the question.
Okay, great. So let me just say we need to Zoom. Hi. Start the Q&A process. Okay, so any questions? Yes.
Yes, to Esther. So there, I can see some grounds for defamation. Have the royal family pressed any kind of defamation charges against Netflix due to there is two of the couple, Charles and his wife, still alive, but Diane would not be able to sue for defamation or anybody on her part. But did that come up in your research?
Yeah, not to my knowledge at all. In fact, what's been so interesting is the royal family have been known to watch and enjoy The Crown, but I've not seen quite as many comments regarding the most recent series. I'm really looking forward to seeing how the next two seasons, season 5 and 6, if they go that far, explore that. Apparently they might even be bringing in narratives about Harry and the other one.
Yeah.
It's the end of the joke. So I'm really excited to see how that's going to all play out. So yeah, but not to my knowledge, which is very interesting.
Oh, great, thank you so much.
Any other questions? Is that a hand there? Yeah, Rhiannon.
I did have another question for Esther, I'm afraid.
That's fine.
But I also have so many questions for the whole panel. But one of the things I was thinking, and I think this could probably apply to the others as well. How annoyed do you get when you watch historical dramas?
It depends. I think you have to see historical dramas as part of a wider engagement with the past. And it's really interesting because often the newspapers focus heavily on this was factually wrong, this was factually wrong, Poldark shouldn't have been harvesting it with the side like that, he should have been doing this, And actually it's much more interesting to look at how they're discursively engaging with the past. So I find that interesting in itself. I mean, if I watch like a mid-19th century period drama, I will be looking at all like the fashions, because that's a little side area of interest for me. So I can get slightly annoyed if things are off, but I think like with Bridgerton, which I briefly mentioned, the costumes are not accurate, but they are there for a very particular purpose within the drama. So I think you have to see more broadly what they're doing with these time periods. And being in the background of shows is even more interesting, but that's maybe a conversation for another day.
Fantastic. Any other questions? Yes, Bobby.
A question for Joe. So if I understood your presentation correctly, you're creating a distinction between creepypasta and conspiracy. Specifically, as you were presenting, I questioned whether the distinction could be collapsed. For example, would QAnon participants maintain the distinction that you're maintaining between the political and the science fiction horror in their own participation? Do you have any data on that?
Well, that's kind of what I was getting to, but again, I misread the brief of the paper by 5 minutes, so I was chopping things out in real time there. So what I was trying to allude to is that the participatory mechanisms by which creepypasta and things like QAnon or other post-QAnon emergent conspiracies function online, and especially invite other users to bring their own perspectives and experiences, and more importantly, their own conspiracies to it, they are exactly the same. The difference comes in that point of reader reception, where if someone was to encounter a creepypasta narrative in the wild, say, they saw a video of the Russian sleep experiment, or Slenderman's outplayed now, but for the sake of example, a bit of Slenderman. There would, given the way that these posts and these narratives are delivered in first person as actual experience, there would be that brief moment of friction, or Todorov's fantastic if you want to go all literary with it. This moment where they have to briefly consider the reality of the world presented in that post, and then square it up against their own real experiences. But people would say, Slenderman isn't real. At the same time, that same pause, that same friction has to happen when people encounter conspiracy narratives, things like QAnon. There, that friction may be a lot longer. People may resonate with the political charging of the conspiracy narrative itself, and not go, "Don't be silly, Hillary Clinton didn't eat a child." There is. Some people will, because some people, react to that, in the same way that they would react to a horror story online. It's posted as fact. It's posted as an experience or something that someone has heard of. Some people will go, "No, that's absolutely silly," but other people will start to engage with it, and it will start to inform their own epistemic framework of reality. And that's where the two divert, is in that moment of friction and reader reception.
Okay, we had a question up there, and then did you not?
Is this my, yeah, sorry. So the question was for Joe as well. So you mentioned the idea of kind of disorientation, and how there are rules of the game for creepypasta that are commonly understood, and that other people may encounter that without knowing rules. To what extent do you think that applies to conspiracy narratives, and do you think that that's a kind of a method by which people are exposed and then become inculcated within them?
Yeah, so I think the difference here is, with creepypasta, those posting it, those writing it, know it's a fiction. They are explicitly writing horror stories online, digital fiction, all the rest of it. But because of that, there is an accepted formal quality to creepypasta. It's usually first person, if not first person, presented as research by someone, and it's posted as an experience, so it can be shared outwards without attribution to a single author. If you copy and paste a first person story, ultimately there is that turn from you being the reader to the teller, because your post then says "I experienced," and it's up to you to then either just enjoy people getting confused or play along with the fiction. Same if you're re-representing these fictional research things into a Slenderman library fire, or the Russian sleep experiment. Again, it's up to you, with that flip from reader to teller, to keep the fictional world and that friction going with readers. There's a really good example of this. There's a comic artist who used to work for BuzzFeed called Adam Ellis, massive profile, blue tick on Twitter, decided to write a ghost story and keep it going for months, to the point where people started believing it. The friction was really interesting there. And then he announced that he sold movie rights, and everyone was like, oh, what are you doing? Just spoil the magic circle there. But the flip side to that with conspiracy theories is that the people participating, the moment of that knowing irony of whether they're telling these stories as knowing fictions to either expand their influence within the community, or promote a grift or take advantage in some way, or whether they sincerely believe it, that is an unknown quantity. You can do a bit of research into particular figures, and 9 times out of 10 it is a grift. But that is an unknown quantity, and because it's an unknown quantity, those predisposed to those narratives and those predisposed to those groups are going to be receiving that with a level of sincerity, because they are resonating with the group. Again, they are approaching that, unaware of any particular game, and the rules there are less explicit because it's not a genre of fiction per se, as it is a participatory narrative that people believe in or don't. So it becomes a lot more of a grey area, and that's what makes it a bit more dangerous and allows people, like you said, to get inculcated into it in quite a subtle way sometimes.
And then Pete, was your question was for Joe as well.
Yeah. So I'd never heard of Creepypasta, so thanks for making my life slightly worse. But so there's probably some lack of knowledge driving this question. But in the kind of connection there with ontological disruption leading to the potential for conspiracy and moving towards the far right, things like that. I was thinking about ontological disruption, especially in light of the deficiencies of logical argumentation that we've been talking about, the need for emotion there as well. And I guess ontological disruption has potential to be positive as well. Is there any examples of that? Is there any examples of creepypasta being used, some genres being used to shift things on a positive direction?
I think for creepypasta, for the most part, I didn't want to start repeating stuff in my abstract, but I place it as the latest point in a tradition in horror and Gothic literature that goes right back to its inception. So horror and Gothic fiction has always, at some point, used the most contemporary form of communication medium as a way to present its narratives as real. The original Castle of Otranto was published as a found document in the library of an ancient Catholic family that was translated by a fictional nobleman and then out for publication. In the second edition, Horace Walpole says, no, it was really successful, I wrote the whole thing, this is a Gothic story, and that's how the term Gothic came about in fictional spaces. And then from there you can trace it through to epistolary novels from the Victorian Gothic era, through to phantasmagorias and other sideshows in that sort of genre, through to the War of the Worlds radio broadcast. Then you can go through to things like early found footage, such as Cannibal Holocaust, where the directors were actually put on trial in Italy because they thought they actually filmed the murder of a bunch of actors, and they had to wheel them out in front of the jury so they could look no, they're alive. They did actually kill a turtle though, so they're not off the hook. And then you can go through to things like Ghost Watch for the BBC, which if you haven't watched Ghost Watch, I know that some people in here are way too young for it, it's on YouTube, it's still bloody scary and brilliant, watch Ghost Watch, that leveraged actual trusted media figures in the UK at the time, so newsreaders, and it was this, at the time, live ghost story that sort of goes horribly wrong. And then you can go through to the found footage era, and most infamously with Blair Witch, which was lightning in a bottle there, because through its viral marketing campaign, it also used a fledgling social media and internet presence to completely throw the fictional world presented in the film into reality. And then creepypasta is the latest version of this really long and storied history within horror, gothic, unnerving fiction. In terms of ontological disruption and instability, frankly, they're just ghost stories on the internet. I don't think any have really tried to do anything groundbreaking socially beyond just existing in a way that forces us to confront the strange ontological nature of social media to begin with. We all have to embody ourselves as text and trust that the other textual representation of a person on the other end of that screen is also a real person. And creepypasta, by existing alongside textual representations of real people, disrupts that inherently in its presence on your social media feed. So that's kind of what it does, really. Now, post-2020 and post the stabbing in Waukesha, Wisconsin, Slenderman's creepypasta in general has kind of been on a bit of a wane. It's not really happening so much anymore. And I genuinely think that's predominantly due to the fact that those same mechanisms of disruption and leveraging sincerity and trust online are now being taken advantage of for much worse things than just trying to tell a cool ghost story. So things have got a little bit real, and creepypasta authors aren't really just doing that anymore.
Okay, thank you. I'm just quickly going to use chair's privilege to ask Chloe, how closely does Dookie sort of stick to the original text in her anthologies? Does she stay quite faithful, or is there a degree of creative license?
I think it varies poem to poem. Some of them are quite faithful. She has one about Tiresias and the idea of going out for a walk. From the point of view of his wife, her husband goes out for a walk as a man and comes home as a woman. And that then becomes a really interesting, longer thought about, well, what would happen if men had periods? What would happen if men experienced sexism in the same way that women do? And then there are some other poems that take massive liberties. So I think it kind of depends on what the point of the revisionism is.
Yeah, I guess part of my question as well is sometimes, I don't know that much about ancient Greek myth, but sometimes in literature, female characters tend to be less fleshed out. And so there's kind of a degree of creative license needed. Interesting, thank you. Any final questions? Okay, in that case, I should hand over to Adam and Emin for the closing remarks. Just before I do, it's been a really fantastic day, and I just wanted, so we want to thank Claire, Alan Greta, Adam, Emin, Jade, Andrew, Gabriel, and Kath, who organised it, and there's been a really huge amount of work gone into it.